Carl Jung. Why the universe removes people. Before your true path begins, there's a truth so uncomfortable, so psychologically precise, that most people will spend their entire lives refusing to see it. And here it is. The people who left you, the ones whose departure shattered you, the ones you still think about in the quiet hours, the ones whose absence created a wound you're convinced will never heal. They didn't leave you by accident. They were removed, surgically, strategically, by an intelligence far greater than your conscious understanding. I know how that sounds. It sounds like spiritual bypass, like the kind of convenient philosophy people use to avoid the raw devastation of loss. But what I'm about to share with you isn't philosophy at all. It's psychological law discovered through decades of clinical observation by one of the most brilliant minds in human history, Carl Jung. Jung spent his entire career studying a phenomenon that most psychologists refuse to acknowledge, that the human psyche possesses an intelligence that operates beyond conscious awareness, orchestrating events in your external life to serve your internal evolution. And nowhere is this intelligence more evident, more ruthless, and more merciful than in the removal of people from your path. Let me be absolutely clear about what we're exploring here. This isn't about making you feel better about loss. This isn't about minimizing your pain or convincing you that everything happens for a reason in some vague cosmic sense. This is about revealing the precise psychological mechanism through which your unconscious mind, what Jung called the self with a capital S, systematically removes people whose continued presence would prevent you from becoming who you're truly meant to be. Think about that for a moment. Really let it land. Every person who has exited your life, suddenly, painfully, inexplicably, wasn't taken from you. They were protecting you from a future where you would never discover your authentic path, where you would remain trapped in a version of yourself that was safe, familiar, and ultimately false. Jung discovered something extraordinary in his clinical work. We don't meet people randomly. Every significant relationship in your life is what he called archetypal, meaning it serves a specific function in your psychological development. Some people enter your life as mirrors reflecting back aspects of yourself you need to see and integrate. Others arrive as scaffolding, providing temporary support while you build internal structure. And some people, this is the most painful category, are present specifically to block you from your destiny until you're ready to step into it. And here's where it gets profound. When these archetypal assignments are complete, when the person has served the function they were unconsciously meant to serve in your individuation, Jung's term for the lifelong process of becoming your true self, the universe removes them, not because they're bad people, not because you failed, but because their role in your story has reached its completion, and their continued presence would now derail everything you're meant to become. I want you to pause right here and think of one person, just one. The person whose exit destroyed you, the relationship that ended and left you convinced you'd never recover, the friend who vanished, the partner who walked away, the mentor who suddenly became unavailable. Hold that person in your mind. By the end of this journey together, you're going to see that person and their departure in a completely different light. You're going to understand not just why they left, but why they had to leave, why the universe's greatest act of love toward you was removing them before your true path could begin. Jung wrote, "We meet people for a reason, a season, or a lifetime, and the unconscious knows which long before the conscious mind does. Your conscious mind wanted them to stay. You would have done anything to keep them. You might still fantasize about their return, but your unconscious, the totality of your psyche that includes dimensions you're not even aware of, already knew. It knew their time was complete. It knew you were ready for the next stage. and it orchestrated circumstances seemingly external and random to move them out of your life so you could move into yours. This is what Jung called synchronicity, meaningful coincidence, the mysterious alignment between internal psychological readiness and external life events. And nowhere is synchronicity more powerful, more precise, and more ruthless than in the removal of people who stand between you and your becoming. Here's what we're going to explore together. First, we're going to dismantle the false belief that keeps you trapped in suffering, the cultural lie that if someone was meant to be in your life, they'd still be there. Then we're going to reveal the 3 distinct categories of removal, each serving a different function in your individuation. We'll dive deep into the shadow's role in relationship endings, explore the intelligent system of synchronicity, and examine the persona maintenance trap that keeps most people locked in relationships built on masks rather than truth. We'll walk through extended case studies, real stories of people whose entire lives were dismantled by seemingly cruel removals, only to discover years later that every single departure was preparing them for a life they couldn't have imagined. We'll explore the excruciating choice between destiny and attachment, reframe the stages of grief through a Jungian lens, and I'll give you a complete practical framework for integrating these removals and using them as fuel for your transformation. But I'm also going to warn you about the dark side of this knowledge, how it can be misused as spiritual bypass, how the ego can inflate with the idea that it's too evolved for normal relationships. Jung himself cautioned against this, and we'll explore why genuine individuation requires both cosmic awareness and personal accountability. And finally, we'll arrive at the truth that changes everything. You were never meant to live a normal life. You were meant to live a conscious life, and consciousness requires loss. It requires death. It requires the courage to let the universe remove what's blocking your emergence, even when that removal feels like it's killing you. The people who left you weren't rejecting you. They were clearing the way. They were saying, in the only language the soul understands, your becoming matters more than our comfort. Your authenticity matters more than our attachment. Your path matters more than our presence. That's why they left. That's why they had to leave. And that's what we're here to understand. Not intellectually, but in the depths of your being where real transformation happens. So let's begin. Let's take this journey into the hidden intelligence of loss, the cruel mercy of removal, and the liberation that waits on the other side of letting go. Before we can understand why the universe removes people from your path, we need to identify the exact belief system that's keeping you trapped in suffering. Because here's what most people don't realize. The pain of loss isn't actually caused by the loss itself. It's caused by the story you're telling yourself about what that loss means. And that story, the one running on loop in your mind every time you think about the person who left, is built on a foundation of lies, cultural lies, psychological lies, lies so deeply embedded in our collective consciousness that we mistake them for truth. The primary lie sounds like this: if someone was truly meant to be in your life, they would still be there. If the relationship was real, it would have lasted. If you were good enough, worthy enough, lovable enough, they wouldn't have left. This belief is absolutely everywhere. It's in every romantic movie where soulmates overcome all obstacles to stay together. It's in every self-help book that tells you to fight for your relationships. It's in every well-meaning friend who says, the right person will stay. It's woven into the very fabric of how we understand love, friendship, and belonging. And it's destroying you, because every time you apply this belief to your situation, you arrive at the same devastating conclusion. Their departure must mean something was wrong with them, with you, with the relationship. It must mean you failed. It must mean the universe is cruel, random, indifferent to your suffering. But Jung discovered something radically different. He found that people don't enter your life as permanent fixtures meant to stay forever unless something goes wrong. They enter as what he called archetypal assignments, psychological functions dressed in human form, appearing at precisely the right moment to serve a specific purpose in your individuation and departing at precisely the right moment when that purpose is complete. Think about that shift. In the conventional model, someone leaving means failure. In Jung's model, someone leaving might mean completion, success, perfect timing. This changes everything. Because if relationships are archetypal assignments rather than permanent contracts, then their ending isn't a tragedy to be avoided. It's a natural transition to be honored. The pain is real. The grief is legitimate, but the meaning you're assigning to it, that interpretation of abandonment, unworthiness, cosmic injustice, that's the lie keeping you stuck. Let me show you what's really happening psychologically. Jung differentiated between two fundamental aspects of your psyche, the ego and the self. The ego is your conscious identity, who you think you are, the story you tell about yourself, your self-image. It's necessary for functioning in the world, but it's also inherently limited, defensive, and terrified of change. The self, capital S, is the totality of your being. It includes your ego, but also encompasses vast unconscious dimensions, your unrealized potential, your suppressed authenticity, your deepest purpose. The self doesn't care about your comfort. It doesn't care about maintaining stable relationships or protecting your self-image. It cares about one thing only, your wholeness, your complete realization as a human being. And here's the tension at the heart of all relationship loss. Your ego wants people to stay. It wants stability, predictability, the comfort of familiar connection. But yourself, when individuation is calling you forward, will systematically remove anyone whose presence keeps you fragmented, inauthentic, or trapped in an outdated version of yourself. This creates an internal war. Your conscious mind is devastated by the departure, replaying every moment, wondering what you could have done differently, fantasizing about their return. Meanwhile, your unconscious has already moved on. It orchestrated the removal. It's already preparing you for what comes next. This is why the suffering of loss feels so specifically torturous. You're not just grieving the person, you're grieving your ego's version of reality. You're being forced to surrender the story you told yourself about who you were with them, what the relationship meant, what future you imagined. That story was how your ego organized reality and maintained its sense of control. Losing the person means losing that organizing narrative. It feels like losing yourself, and in a way, you are. But what you don't realize yet is that the self you're losing was never your true self. It was the self that needed that person to exist. It was the self built around that relationship. And that self, however comfortable, however familiar, was preventing your authentic self from emerging. Let me give you a concrete example. Think about how many people stay in relationships, romantic, friendship, even family, not because those relationships are nourishing their growth, but because those relationships are comfortable. Because they've built an entire identity around being with that person, being part of that dynamic, playing a certain role. Maybe you're the caretaker in a friendship where your friend is perpetually in crisis. Your identity has become organized around being the strong one, the helper, the person who saves them. On the surface, the friendship seems meaningful. But Jung would ask, is this relationship serving your individuation, or is it preventing it? Are you growing into more of yourself, or are you trapped in a role that keeps you from exploring your own vulnerability, your own needs, your own complexity? When the self decides it's time for you to integrate your shadow, to reclaim the parts of yourself you've been projecting onto others or suppressing to maintain a role, It will remove the relationships that keep that role in place. Your friend might suddenly pull away, end the friendship, or reveal themselves in a way that makes continuing the relationship impossible. And your ego will be devastated. How could they do this? After everything I did for them. But yourself is celebrating. Finally you're free to stop performing that role. Finally, you can discover who you are when you're not constantly saving someone else. This is the pattern operating beneath every significant removal in your life. The universe, or more precisely, the intelligence of your own psyche working through synchronicity, is removing people whose continued presence would prevent you from individuating. And the reason this is so painful is because your ego is attached to static identity, while your self demands evolution. Jung wrote, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain. People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul." And one of the primary ways we avoid facing our soul is by maintaining relationships that keep us asleep. Relationships where we're performing rather than being. Relationships where we're projecting rather than relating. Relationships where we're comfortable rather than growing. The collective wound we're all carrying is this. We've been taught that relationship longevity equals relationship success. That staying together means you did it right, and separating means someone failed. But Jung observed the opposite in his clinical work. He found that many of his patients who were most psychologically fragmented were in long-term relationships where they'd never been seen for who they truly are. They'd maintained the relationship by maintaining a mask, what Jung called the persona, and that mask had slowly replaced their actual identity. On the other hand, he observed that some of his most individuated patients, people who had achieved remarkable wholeness and authenticity, had experienced devastating relationship losses that forced them to reconstruct their entire sense of self. The loss wasn't the tragedy. Staying in the false relationship would have been the tragedy. This is the reframe we desperately need. The question isn't why did they leave? The question is, what was I meant to discover that I could only discover through their leaving? Let me ask you directly, when you think about the person whose departure devastated you, are you mourning the actual person, the reality of who they were, flaws and all? Or are you mourning who you were with them? Are you grieving the loss of their presence, or the loss of the identity you'd constructed around that relationship? For most people, if they're brutally honest, it's the latter. We're not usually mourning the person. We're mourning the story. We're mourning the version of ourselves that relationship allowed us to be. We're mourning the future we imagined. We're mourning the meaning we'd assigned to that connection. And all of that, the story, the imagined future, the assigned meaning, is ego construction. It's not truth. And the self, in its ruthless commitment to your wholeness, will dismantle ego constructions no matter how much you're attached to them. This is why you can't think your way out of this kind of grief. Your ego is doing the grieving. It's trying to maintain control, trying to make sense of something that doesn't make sense within its framework. But yourself isn't grieving at all. It's already in the next chapter, waiting for your consciousness to catch up. The false belief keeping you stuck is the belief that their leaving means something went wrong. What if their leaving means something went right? What if the universe saw you clinging to a relationship that was keeping you small and loved you enough to intervene? What if their departure wasn't abandonment but liberation? I know that sounds impossible right now. I know your entire being wants to resist that interpretation, but stay with me. Because we're about to go deeper into the specific mechanisms of removal, the three distinct categories, each with its own psychological function. And when you understand which category your loss falls into, everything changes. The problem isn't that people leave. The problem is that we've been taught to interpret their leaving through the ego's lens of inadequacy, rather than through the self's lens of evolution. We've been taught that loss equals failure rather than understanding that loss is the primary mechanism of growth. You cannot become who you're meant to be while maintaining every relationship you've ever had. It's psychologically impossible, because becoming requires letting go. It requires death, not physical death, but ego death. The death of outdated identities, roles, and relationships that were perfect for who you were, but insufficient for who you're becoming. And the universe, through the intelligence Jung called the self, is already orchestrating this on your behalf. It's already removing what needs to be removed. Your only choice is whether you resist the process and suffer in confusion, or surrender to it and transform in consciousness. That's what we're here to do, to move from confusion to consciousness, to see your losses not as evidence of unworthiness, but as evidence that your soul has ambitions for you far greater than your ego can currently comprehend. So let's examine exactly how this removal process works. Let's look at the 3 categories of archetypal exit and see which one or which combination you've experienced. Because once you understand the mechanism, you can't unsee it. And once you can't unsee it, you're free. Not all departures are created equal. This is crucial to understand. The universe doesn't use a single strategy when removing people from your path. It uses precise, targeted interventions based on exactly what your individuation requires at that moment. Jung's decades of clinical observation revealed 3 distinct categories of synchronistic removal, each corresponding to a different stage and need in your psychological development. Missing someone without understanding which category their removal falls into is like having a map without coordinates. You know you're lost, but you don't know where you are or how to move forward. So let's establish the framework. Let's give you the coordinates. Category 1. The mirror removal. The first category is what Jung would recognize immediately as shadow work made manifest in relationship. These are the people who entered your life specifically to reflect back aspects of yourself that you needed to see but couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge on your own. Jung discovered that we unconsciously choose certain people to carry our shadow. Those rejected, denied, or repressed parts of ourselves that we've buried because they conflict with our self-image. Sometimes we project our darkness onto them, our rage, our selfishness, our cruelty. Other times we project our light, our power, our beauty, our potential. Either way, we're not actually seeing the person. We're seeing ourselves reflected back through them. The mirror removal happens when you've finally integrated, or are ready to integrate, what that person was reflecting. Once you've seen the shadow aspect they were carrying for you, once you've reclaimed that projection and made it conscious, their archetypal function is complete. They were never meant to stay. They were meant to show you something, and once the showing is complete, the universe removes them. Let me give you a concrete example. I'll call him David. David had a friend, we'll call him Marcus, who infuriated him. Marcus was arrogant, constantly bragging about his accomplishments, dominating conversations, making everything about himself. David found himself obsessively focused on Marcus's behavior, constantly irritated, judging him, complaining about him to other friends. But here's what David didn't realize. Marcus was carrying David's shadow. David had grown up in a family where showing pride in yourself was seen as arrogant, where self-promotion was shameful, where making yourself visible was dangerous. So David had suppressed his own ambition, his own desire for recognition, his own need to be seen. He'd built an identity around humility, but it was false humility, born from fear rather than genuine groundedness. Marcus entered David's life at exactly the moment David was ready, unconsciously, to confront this suppression. Every time Marcus bragged, David felt rage. But that rage wasn't really about Marcus. It was about the part of David that desperately wanted to brag too, but couldn't let himself. Marcus was showing David his own rejected ambition, his own suppressed need for visibility, his own denied right to take up space. This went on for 2 years. 2 years of David being triggered by Marcus, obsessing over Marcus, feeling both drawn to and repelled by him. Classic shadow projection. Then something shifted. David started therapy, started doing his own work, and one session, he had a breakthrough. I'm not angry at Marcus. I'm angry at myself for being invisible. Within 3 weeks of that realization, Marcus announced he was moving across the country for a job opportunity. The friendship ended naturally, without drama, as if Marcus's role in David's story had simply completed itself. Because it had. David had finally seen what Marcus was reflecting. He'd reclaimed his own right to ambition, visibility, and healthy pride. He no longer needed an external mirror. The shadow had been integrated. That's the mirror removal. And here's how you identify if someone in your life fell into this category. Ask yourself, was I disproportionately triggered by this person? Did they evoke strong reactions, either positive or negative, that felt out of proportion to who they actually were? Was I obsessed with their flaws or idealized their strengths? If yes, they were likely carrying your shadow. And if they left after you had some realization, some shift in how you see yourself, some integration of a previously denied aspect of your psyche, that's textbook mirror removal. They weren't meant to stay. They were meant to show you yourself. Category 2, the scaffold removal. The second category is equally precise, but serves a different function. These are the people who entered your life specifically to provide temporary support while you built internal structure. Jung understood that individuation doesn't happen in isolation. We need relationship, mentorship, community during vulnerable growth phases. But the key word is temporary. The scaffold removal occurs when you've internalized what that person was providing externally, when you've built the internal capacity that made their external support necessary, when you can now stand on your own in a way you couldn't when they first arrived. Think about it literally. When you're constructing a building, you need scaffolding. The scaffolding provides support and structure during the construction phase. But once the building is complete, once it has its own structural integrity, the scaffolding isn't just unnecessary, it's actually an obstruction. It needs to be removed so the building can be fully seen and utilized. This is exactly what happens psychologically with certain relationships. Let me tell you about Sarah. Sarah was going through a devastating divorce in her early 30s. Her entire identity had been organized around being a wife. Her entire social world was her husband's friends and family. When the marriage ended, she had nothing, no sense of self, no community, no direction. That's when Elizabeth entered her life. Elizabeth was a colleague at work who seemed to intuitively understand what Sarah needed. She became Sarah's anchor, checking in daily, inviting her to events, introducing her to new people, helping her explore new interests. For 3 years, Elizabeth was the scaffolding that held Sarah up while Sarah rebuilt herself from the ground up. Sarah developed her own friendships, her own hobbies, her own sense of purpose. She went back to school. She discovered a passion for painting. She built a life that was truly hers for the first time. And somewhere in year 4, something imperceptible shifted. Sarah no longer needed Elizabeth in the same way. She'd internalized Elizabeth's belief in her. She'd developed her own support system. She had structural integrity. Within months, Elizabeth got a job in another city and moved away. The friendship didn't end dramatically. It just naturally faded as their lives diverged. And Sarah, after the initial sadness, realized something profound. Elizabeth had been an angel in her life for exactly as long as she needed one. The removal wasn't rejection, it was completion. The scaffolding had done its job. The scaffold removal is one of the most misunderstood categories because it often involves people we genuinely love, people who genuinely helped us, people we're convinced we'll need forever. We can't imagine standing without them, but that's precisely the point. The universe removes them, so we're forced to discover that we can. How do you identify a scaffold removal? Ask yourself, did this person appear during a crisis or major transition in my life? Did they provide support, structure, or guidance that I didn't have internally? Have I grown significantly since they entered my life? Do I now possess capabilities or confidence that I lacked when we met? If the answer is yes, and if their departure coincided with you reaching a new level of independence or self-sufficiency, you've experienced scaffold removal. They weren't meant to stay forever. They were meant to hold you until you could hold yourself. And the greatest gift you can give them and yourself is recognizing that their work is complete. Category 3. The blocker removal. Now we arrive at the most painful, most misunderstood, and most essential category, the blocker removal. This is when the universe removes someone not because you've learned what they had to teach, and not because you no longer need their support, but because their very presence, however loving, however well-intentioned, is preventing you from encountering your destiny. This is the category that breaks people, because unlike mirror removal, where you can eventually see the shadow projection, and scaffold removal, where you can eventually feel gratitude for the temporary support, blocker removal often makes no logical sense. The relationship seems perfect. The person seems wonderful. There's love, compatibility, mutual support. From every external perspective, they should stay. But they can't, because something in your unconscious knows, with a certainty your conscious mind cannot access, that your true path requires you to be free of this relationship, not because the relationship is bad, but because it's keeping you in a life that isn't yours. Let me share Michael's story. Michael met Rebecca when he was 26. She was everything he thought he wanted: intelligent, kind, supportive, beautiful. They built a life together in the city where they'd both grown up, surrounded by family and friends. Michael had a stable job in his father's company. They bought a house. By all conventional measures, Michael was living the dream. But Michael started having dreams. Actual dreams, the kind Jung spent his career analyzing. In these dreams, he was always traveling, always alone, always in landscapes vastly different from the suburban life he was living. He'd wake up with a feeling he couldn't name. Not dissatisfaction with Rebecca, not unhappiness with his life, but a growing sense that he was living someone else's story. He ignored it. He loved Rebecca. He had the perfect life. He pushed the feeling down. But the unconscious doesn't stay quiet when individuation is calling. Michael started experiencing anxiety, then panic attacks, then a deep depression that came from nowhere and everywhere. He saw therapists who couldn't find a cause. Nothing was wrong, and yet everything was wrong. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, Rebecca sat him down and said she was leaving. She couldn't explain it rationally. There was no infidelity, no fight, no clear reason. She just knew with absolute certainty that she had to go. Michael was devastated. He begged her to stay, to try therapy, to give it more time. But she was unwavering. Something was calling her forward, and she had to answer. The breakup destroyed Michael. He left the city, left his father's company, spent 6 months traveling aimlessly through South America, which is when he discovered his actual calling: photography, specifically documentary photography in conflict zones, a calling that would have been absolutely impossible with the life he'd been living, a calling that required complete freedom, constant travel, and a willingness to risk everything. 5 years later, Michael has won international awards for his work documenting human resilience in war-torn regions. His photographs have literally changed policy, influenced aid distribution, brought attention to forgotten crises. He's living a life of profound purpose that he couldn't have imagined in his old life, and he knows, without a doubt, that he could never have answered this calling if Rebecca had stayed. Her presence, her love, the life they'd built, it would have been impossible to walk away from. The universe had to remove her first. That's blocker removal. And it's devastating because both people can be wonderful, the relationship can be healthy, and it still has to end. Because authenticity cannot coexist with a life that wasn't meant for you, no matter how beautiful that life looks from the outside. How do you identify blocker removal? This is harder because it requires brutal honesty. Ask yourself, does my relationship with this person require me to stay in a certain location, maintain a certain lifestyle, or be a certain version of myself? Have I felt a calling, a pull toward something that would be impossible to pursue with this person in my life? Do I sense that my true path would require changes they'd never accept, or changes I'd feel too guilty making while still with them? If you're feeling a yes in your body right now, not in your head, where you can rationalize anything, but in your body, where truth lives, then you've likely experienced or are currently in a blocker removal situation. And here's what's crucial to understand. The person being removed often feels it first. Rebecca knew she had to leave before Michael consciously knew he needed her to. That's how synchronicity works. The unconscious of one person aligns with the unconscious of another to serve both people's individuation. Rebecca wasn't just freeing Michael, she was freeing herself to pursue her own authentic path. Both souls were saying, we cannot become who we're meant to be while maintaining who we've been together. These three categories, mirror, scaffold, and blocker, account for the vast majority of significant removals in your life. And here's the pattern Jung observed. They often happen in sequence. First, mirror removals that force you to see and integrate your shadow. Then, scaffold removals that force you to develop internal structure and self-sufficiency. Finally, blocker removals that clear the path for your authentic calling to emerge. Think about your own losses. Can you see the pattern? Can you identify which category each significant departure falls into? Because once you can name the archetypal function, you can stop taking the removal personally and start honoring it as part of your individuation journey. The person who triggered your rage and then left. Mirror removal. They showed you your shadow, and once you saw it, they had to go. The mentor who supported you through a crisis and then naturally faded. Scaffold removal. They held you until you could hold yourself. The seemingly perfect relationship that ended inexplicably. Blocker removal. They were removed so your destiny could find you. Jung wrote, the meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. If not, nothing happens. Every person who has catalyzed your transformation through their presence or their departure was meant to. That's their role. That's why they came, and that's why they left. Your pain is valid, your grief is real, but your interpretation that they're leaving means you failed, that you weren't enough, that love isn't real. That interpretation is preventing you from seeing the actual pattern. The universe isn't cruel, it's precise, and every removal is surgical, strategic, designed to serve your becoming. Now that you understand the categories, we need to go deeper. We need to explore one of the most uncomfortable truths in all of Jung's work, why many relationships must end not because of incompatibility, but because of shadow projection. And that's where we're heading next. We need to talk about something that most people will spend their entire lives avoiding, the real reason many relationships end. And it's not what you think. It's not incompatibility. It's not growing apart. It's not even the standard explanations we give ourselves and others to make sense of the loss. The real reason is this. You chose that person to carry your shadow, and when individuation called you to reclaim it, the relationship could not survive the withdrawal of that projection. This is going to be uncomfortable. It's meant to be, because Jung insisted that there is no individuation without shadow integration, and there is no shadow integration without confronting the ways we've used other people to avoid confronting ourselves. Let me explain what shadow projection actually is, because this term gets thrown around without people understanding its devastating implications for relationships. Jung discovered that from childhood, we learn which parts of ourselves are acceptable and which are not. The parts deemed unacceptable by our family, our culture, our early experiences don't disappear. They go underground. They become what Jung called the shadow. All the aspects of yourself you've rejected, denied, or repressed because they conflicted with your ego ideal. But here's what's crucial. The shadow doesn't stay dormant. It has enormous psychic energy, and that energy has to go somewhere. So unconsciously, brilliantly, destructively, you project it onto other people. You choose people who will carry the shadow for you, allowing you to experience those rejected parts of yourself vicariously without having to acknowledge them as yours. Sometimes we project our dark shadow, our capacity for cruelty, manipulation, selfishness. We find someone who embodies these qualities and we're magnetically drawn to them, fascinated and repulsed simultaneously because they're living out the parts of ourselves we can't admit exist. Other times, and this is what most people miss, we project our golden shadow, our power, our brilliance, our worthiness. These are the people we idealize, the ones we think are better than us, more capable, more deserving. We're not actually seeing them accurately. We're seeing our own unrealized potential projected onto their life. Either way, dark or golden, what you're experiencing isn't actually the other person. It's yourself reflected back through the relationship. And this creates a very specific type of connection, intense, consuming, often mistaken for deep compatibility or soulmate connection, but actually built on a foundation of unconscious psychological transaction. Let me tell you about my own experience with this because I'm not speaking theoretically. I'm speaking from the wreckage of a relationship that ended precisely because of shadow projection, and it took me years to understand why. Her name was Anna. When I met her, I was convinced I'd found my person. She was confident where I was insecure. She was bold where I was cautious. She pursued her ambitions without apology, while I downplayed my own aspirations to avoid seeming arrogant. I was drawn to her with an intensity that felt like fate. But what I didn't realize, what I couldn't see, was that I wasn't attracted to Anna. I was attracted to the parts of myself I'd projected onto her, my own confidence that I'd suppressed because being confident felt dangerous in my family, my own boldness that I'd rejected because taking up space meant risking rejection, my own ambition that I'd minimized because my father had called ambition selfishness. Anna was carrying my golden shadow, and our entire relationship was organized around an unconscious bargain. I'll stay small and admire your bigness, and in return, I get to experience those qualities vicariously through you without having to risk embodying them myself. For 2 years, this worked. I thought we were perfect together, but underneath, I was slowly dying. Because when you project your golden shadow, you're essentially giving away your power. You're outsourcing your wholeness. You're remaining fragmented while convincing yourself you're in love. Then I started doing my own Jungian work, started questioning why I made myself small, started reclaiming my own right to confidence, boldness, ambition, and the moment I did, the moment I started withdrawing my projection and recognizing those qualities as mine, everything changed. Anna felt it before I consciously understood it. She said I was changing, that I was becoming someone she didn't recognize, that our dynamic felt different. And she was right. The dynamic was different. because I was no longer projecting onto her. I was no longer content to stay small and admire her bigness. I was starting to claim my own. The relationship couldn't survive that shift because it had never been based on two whole people relating authentically. It had been based on unconscious projection, and when I withdrew that projection to reclaim my shadow, the foundation dissolved. The breakup was agonizing. I went through all the stages of grief, blamed myself, blamed her, tried to figure out what went wrong. But what actually went wrong was that something went right. My individuation had called me to reclaim what I'd given away. The universe removed Anna not because she was bad for me, but because the relationship was built on fragmentation and my psyche was demanding wholeness. 3 years later, I can see it clearly. Anna wasn't my soulmate. She was my shadow carrier, and her presence in my life, however beautiful it felt, was preventing me from becoming whole. The universe's greatest mercy was ending that relationship so I could discover who I was when I wasn't giving my power away. That's shadow projection. And here's what most people don't realize. The majority of intense relationships, especially the ones that feel fated, consuming, impossible to live without, are built primarily on shadow projection, not love, not authentic connection. Projection. Jung observed a consistent pattern in his clinical work. People would form relationships based on unconscious shadow exchanges, and as long as both people remained unconscious, the relationship could continue. But the moment one person started individuating, started withdrawing their projections and reclaiming their shadow, the relationship would enter crisis. Sometimes it could be transformed into an authentic relationship between two whole people, but more often it had to end. Because the foundation, projection, no longer existed. This is why so many relationships end during or after therapy. It's not that therapy ruins relationships, as some people claim. It's that therapy facilitates individuation, and individuation requires withdrawing projections, and many relationships cannot survive that withdrawal because they were never based on seeing each other accurately in the first place. Let me show you how to identify if a relationship in your life was primarily shadow-based. This requires ruthless honesty, the kind that makes you squirm. But Jung insisted that the truth, however uncomfortable, is the path to freedom. First question, were you disproportionately fascinated by this person? Did you think about them constantly, feel like you couldn't live without them, experience them as larger than life, more important than other people? If yes, you were likely projecting your golden shadow, your own unrealized magnificence. Second question, were you disproportionately triggered by this person? Did they evoke rage, jealousy, disgust, or judgment that felt out of proportion to their actual behavior? Did you obsess over their flaws, feel morally superior to them while secretly envying them? If yes, you were likely projecting your dark shadow, your own rejected qualities. Third question, did your sense of self feel dependent on their presence or perception? Did you feel more real, more worthy, more complete when they validated you? Did their absence or withdrawal trigger existential panic? If yes, you were outsourcing your selfhood, the ultimate shadow projection. Fourth question, when you think about who you were in that relationship, do you recognize yourself? Or were you performing a version of yourself, more accommodating, more impressive, more together than you actually felt? If it was performance, you were maintaining your persona, your public mask, while projecting your authentic self onto them, hoping they'd love the real you by proxy. If you answered yes to any of these questions, you've engaged in shadow projection. And here's what's crucial to understand. This doesn't make you bad. It doesn't make the relationship meaningless. Shadow projection is a universal human mechanism. Jung said everyone does it. The question isn't whether you project, it's whether you become conscious of it. And consciousness is exactly what individuation demands. At some point, usually during midlife, but increasingly in our modern world, much earlier, the self says, enough. Enough fragmentation, enough giving your power away, enough outsourcing your wholeness. It's time to become complete. And when that call comes, relationships built primarily on projection cannot continue as they were. They must either transform or end. And the transformation required is so radical, so complete, that it essentially creates a new relationship between two different people. Most relationships don't survive it, not because people are weak or uncommitted, but because the unconscious bargain that created the relationship, "I'll carry your shadow if you carry mine," is no longer operational. Both people have to reclaim their projections simultaneously and consciously choose to rebuild from wholeness. That's rare. That's why the removal happens. Here's what makes this particularly devastating. When you're in a shadow-based relationship, the intensity feels like proof of its importance. The fact that you can't stop thinking about them, that their presence affects you so profoundly, that losing them feels like it will destroy you. All of that feels like evidence that this is the one. This is real love. This is destiny. But Jung would say that intensity is evidence of projection, not compatibility. Real love, mature, individuated love, doesn't consume you. It doesn't make you feel incomplete without the other person. It doesn't require you to be anyone other than who you are. Shadow projection feels intense because you're encountering yourself through the other person, and that self-encounter creates psychic friction, fascination, obsession. When the universe removes someone you've been projecting onto, what you're actually experiencing isn't the loss of them. It's the loss of the part of yourself you'd placed in their custody. You're being forced to take it back, to own it, to integrate it, and that process feels like identity death because a version of you is dying. The version that needed projection to feel whole. The version that used another person as a container for the parts of yourself you couldn't accept. This is what Jung meant when he said, individuation is a process of death and rebirth. Not metaphorical death, actual death of false structures, including relationships built on those structures. And not metaphorical rebirth, actual emergence of your authentic self from the ashes of who you pretended to be. The shadow's role in relationship endings is this. As you individuate, you must withdraw your projections and reclaim your shadow, both the dark aspects you've denied and the golden aspects you've disowned. Any relationship that was primarily organized around carrying those projections for you will dissolve when you take them back. Not might dissolve, will dissolve. Because the foundation, the unconscious bargain, is gone. This is why the pain of certain losses feels so specifically existential. You're not just grieving a person, you're grieving the version of yourself that existed in relation to them. You're grieving the identity structure you'd built around that projection. You're grieving the comfortable fragmentation that allowed you to remain unconscious. And underneath the grief is terror, because if you're not the person you were with them, then who are you? If you can't project your power onto them, then you have to claim it yourself. And what if you fail? If you can't project your darkness onto them, then you have to acknowledge it in yourself. And what if that makes you unlovable? These are the questions the shadow brings. These are the initiations individuation demands. And the universe removes the people you've been using to avoid these questions specifically so you're forced to answer them. Jung wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." The people you've been in relationship with, especially the ones whose departure devastated you, were often the ones carrying your darkness so you didn't have to look at it. Their removal is the universe saying, look now, integrate now, become whole now. I want to be clear about something. This doesn't mean every ended relationship was based on shadow projection. Some relationships end for practical reasons. Some complete their archetypal purpose without heavy shadow involvement. But if you're still thinking about someone years later, if their absence still creates a wound that won't heal, if you still feel like a part of you is missing, that's shadow. That's projection you haven't yet reclaimed. And the path forward isn't about getting them back. It's about getting you back. The parts of yourself you gave to them, the qualities you projected onto them, the wholeness you outsourced through them. This is difficult work. It requires looking at yourself without flinching, acknowledging the ways you've used people, recognizing that what you thought was love might have been unconscious transaction. It requires grieving not just the person, but the comfortable fragmentation their presence allowed. But on the other side of this work is something you've maybe never experienced. Relationships built on wholeness rather than projection. Connection with people who see you as you actually are, not as a container for their shadow. The capacity to love without losing yourself. To be intimate without merging, to appreciate someone's qualities, without needing to possess them or outsource your own. That's what individuated love looks like, and you cannot arrive there while still clinging to relationships built on projection. The universe knows this. Your unconscious knows this. That's why the removal happened, not as punishment but as invitation. Invitation to reclaim what you've given away. Invitation to become whole. Invitation to discover who you are when you're no longer using other people to avoid being yourself. So before we move forward, I want you to sit with this question. Who were you projecting onto, and what part of yourself did they carry that you now must reclaim? Because until you answer that question, until you do that reclamation work, you'll keep repeating the pattern. You'll find new people to carry the same projections. You'll recreate the same intensity, the same drama, the same inevitable ending. The faces will change, but the dynamic won't. The universe removed them to break the pattern. Your job now is to not recreate it, and to understand why this removal happened when it did, why the timing was precisely right, even though it felt devastating. We need to explore Jung's most mystical concept, synchronicity. The intelligence system that's been orchestrating your life all along, including every person who's entered and exited right on schedule. That's where we're going next. There's a question that haunts everyone who's lost someone important. Why now? Why did they leave at this exact moment? Why not sooner when it might have hurt less? Why not later when maybe you could have worked it out? The answer lies in one of Carl Jung's most profound and controversial discoveries, synchronicity. The principle that reveals the universe isn't random, chaos isn't meaningless, and the timing of events, especially relationship endings, is far more precise than your conscious mind can comprehend. Jung spent decades developing this concept, knowing it would be dismissed by his colleagues as mystical thinking. But he persisted because his clinical observations made it undeniable. There is an intelligence at work in the patterning of events, an intelligence that operates at the intersection of inner psychological readiness and outer circumstantial change. And nowhere is this intelligence more visible than in the removal of people from your path. Let me give you Jung's actual definition first, then show you what it means in concrete terms. He wrote, "Synchronicity is a causal connecting principle, meaning events that are connected by meaning rather than by cause and effect. Two things happen simultaneously or in sequence, and they're related not because one caused the other, but because they both serve the same purpose in your individuation. This is difficult for our rational minds to accept. We're trained to think in terms of cause and effect. I did something that caused them to leave. They met someone else, which caused our breakup. We fought, which caused the friendship to end. Cause, effect, cause, effect. But Jung observed something stranger. Many significant life transitions happen through what appear to be coincidences, events that line up in ways that defy probability, that couldn't have been planned, that seem to have their own intelligence. Someone suddenly moves to another city, just as you're ready to leave a codependent friendship. A relationship ends right before you discover a calling that requires total freedom. A mentor appears exactly when you need guidance, then vanishes exactly when you've internalized their teaching. Your conscious mind experiences these as random. Your ego scrambles to find causality, to figure out who's to blame, to understand what you could have done differently. But your unconscious, yourself, the totality of your psyche, already knew. It orchestrated the circumstances. It aligned your inner readiness with outer events. It removed the person because you were ready for the next stage, even though you didn't consciously know it yet. This is what synchronicity means in practice. Your self has access to information your ego doesn't. It can sense when you're psychologically prepared for transition, when you've learned what you needed to learn, when continuing in the current situation would prevent your growth. And it uses synchronicity, meaningful coincidence, to create the circumstances that move you forward. Let me show you how this actually works with real examples, because this concept only becomes believable when you see the pattern. Case 1. The geographic synchronicity. Jennifer had been in a relationship for 7 years. On the surface, nothing was fundamentally wrong. They loved each other. They were compatible. But Jennifer had been feeling a persistent, unnamed restlessness for the past year, a sense that something was calling her, though she couldn't articulate what. She started having recurring dreams about the ocean. She'd grown up landlocked in the Midwest and had only seen the ocean a few times in her life. But in her dreams, she was always near water, standing on cliffs, walking beaches, feeling pulled toward the horizon. She mentioned this to her partner casually, laughed about it, dismissed it as stress. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, her partner got a job offer across the country, back in his home state, away from the ocean, deeper into the interior. He was excited. This was the career opportunity he'd been hoping for. He assumed Jennifer would come with him. But the moment he told her, something in Jennifer's body said no with absolute clarity. She couldn't explain it rationally. The job was great. The move made practical sense. But her unconscious was screaming that if she followed him, she'd be moving away from something essential, even though she had no idea what that something was. They tried to work it out, talked about long distance, considered him turning down the job, but within 3 weeks they both knew, with a certainty that bypassed all logic, that the relationship was over. He moved, she stayed. 6 months later, Jennifer was walking through a local bookstore and noticed a flyer for marine biology research opportunities. She'd been an environmental science major in college, but had gone into corporate sustainability work instead. Stable, respectable, safe. But something about that flyer stopped her completely. She applied. She got accepted. Within a year, she'd completely changed her career trajectory and moved to the coast to work in ocean conservation. 3 years later, Jennifer is a marine biologist doing research on coral reef restoration. She's living exactly the life her dreams were trying to show her, and she knows, without doubt, that if her partner hadn't gotten that job offer, if the relationship hadn't ended exactly when it did, she would never have been free to answer the call. That's synchronicity. The job offer wasn't random. The timing wasn't coincidental. Her partner's opportunity arrived at the exact moment Jennifer was unconsciously ready to redirect her life, but couldn't do so while maintaining the relationship. The synchronicity created the conditions for both of them to follow their authentic paths. Case 2. The illness synchronicity. Marcus had a best friend, Daniel, who had been his primary support system for 15 years. They'd been through everything together: breakups, career changes, family deaths. Marcus couldn't imagine his life without Daniel. They talked daily. They vacationed together. Marcus considered Daniel his chosen family, but what Marcus didn't realize was that the friendship had become codependent. Marcus had never developed the capacity to process emotions alone. Every crisis, every challenge, every difficult feeling, he immediately called Daniel. He'd outsourced his emotional regulation to the friendship. His internal structure was weak because external support was always available. Then Daniel was diagnosed with cancer, stage 3. Treatment was intensive. Daniel had to focus completely on his survival. He couldn't be there for Marcus in the way he'd always been. The friendship didn't end, but its functional dynamic, Daniel as Marcus's emotional processor, did. Marcus spiraled at first, felt abandoned, even though he understood intellectually that Daniel was fighting for his life. Felt terrified of his own emotions without Daniel to help him process them. Felt guilty for making Daniel's crisis about his own needs. But something else happened too. Marcus was forced to develop capacities he'd never built. He started therapy, not couples therapy or friendship counseling, but his own individual work. He learned to sit with difficult emotions without immediately externalizing them. He developed an internal observer, a capacity for self-reflection, a relationship with his own inner world. Daniel survived the cancer. They're still friends. But the friendship is completely different now. Marcus doesn't need Daniel to function emotionally. He's developed his own structure, and ironically, the friendship is deeper now because it's not based on need. It's based on choice, mutual appreciation, genuine connection between two whole people. Looking back, Marcus can see the synchronicity. Daniel's illness arrived at the exact moment Marcus was ready, unconsciously, to develop internal capacity. If Daniel had remained healthy and available, Marcus would have continued outsourcing his emotional life indefinitely. The illness wasn't punishment. It was synchronicity, a painful but perfectly timed event that served both people's individuation. Case 3. The prophetic dream synchronicity. This one is more mysterious, but Jung documented many cases like it. A woman named Teresa was in what seemed like a solid marriage. 23 years together, raised 2 children, no major problems. But Teresa started having disturbing dreams. In the dreams, she was always alone in a house she didn't recognize. The house was beautiful, filled with light, but empty. She'd walk through the rooms feeling not loneliness, but a strange, peaceful solitude. She'd wake up confused, slightly guilty because she loved her husband and had no conscious desire to be alone. The dreams persisted for a year, became more frequent, more detailed. She started recognizing objects in the dream house, paintings she'd wanted to buy but her husband didn't like, furniture in styles he found impractical, rooms arranged for solitary creative work rather than family gathering. Then her husband confessed he'd been having an affair. For 6 months, he was in love with someone else. He wanted a divorce. Teresa was devastated, but underneath the devastation was something else. Recognition. Her unconscious had known. The dreams had been preparing her, showing her a life alone not as punishment but as possibility. A life that would be hers in ways her marriage had never fully been. During the divorce, Teresa remembered the dreams, started paying attention to them, and she began making different choices, not just reactively getting through the divorce, but actively creating the life her dreams had shown her. She bought a house, her own house, for the first time in her life. She arranged it exactly as the dream house had been arranged. She set up a studio for the paintings she'd stopped doing 20 years earlier, when the demands of marriage and motherhood took precedence. 5 years post-divorce, Teresa says those dreams saved her life. Not by predicting the betrayal, but by showing her that being alone could be beautiful, creative, authentically hers. The dreams were synchronistic preparation. Her unconscious knowing before her conscious mind did that the marriage would end. and beginning the psychological work of readiness before the event occurred. These 3 cases, and Jung documented hundreds more, reveal the mechanism of synchronicity in relationship removal. It's not that the universe randomly takes people away and you have to find meaning afterward. It's that your unconscious recognizes when you're ready for transition, and it orchestrates circumstances, job offers, illnesses, even the unconscious choices of other people, to create the conditions for that transition to occur. This is what Jung meant when he differentiated between the ego and the self. Your ego wants stability, wants to maintain the current situation, wants people to stay. But yourself, the totality of your psyche, including vast unconscious dimensions, cares only about your wholeness, your authentic development, your complete individuation. And when those 2 agendas conflict, the self wins. Every time. The self uses synchronicity as its operational language. It can't force you consciously. You have free will. But it can create circumstances that make certain choices obvious, certain paths available, certain relationships untenable. It speaks through dreams, through persistent intuitions, through the mysterious alignment of external events, with internal readiness. This is why fighting against certain relationship endings feels like fighting against fate itself, because in a sense, you are. Not fate in the sense of predetermined destiny, but fate in the sense of your own deep intelligence trying to move you toward wholeness. Your ego is saying, I want them to stay. Your self is saying, it's time for them to go. And the self, having access to information your ego doesn't, orchestrates the synchronicity that makes the departure happen. How do you distinguish synchronicity from randomness? Jung said to look for meaningfulness. Random events are just events. Things happen, you move on. Synchronistic events are loaded with meaning. They feel significant in a way you can't quite explain. They arrive at moments of transition or crisis. They align with dreams, intuitions, or persistent feelings you've been having. They create conditions that serve your psychological development, even though they're painful. If a relationship ended and you felt nothing but relief, that's probably not synchronicity. That's just an overdue ending. But if a relationship ended and you felt devastated, yet simultaneously sensed some deeper rightness to the timing, some way it aligned with other changes happening in your life, some recognition that you were being moved toward something even though you didn't know what, that's synchronicity. The relationship that ended right before you discovered your calling? Synchronicity. The friendship that dissolved when you were ready to stop repeating a pattern? Synchronicity. The mentor who appeared when you needed guidance and vanished when you'd internalized their teaching? Synchronicity. Your rational mind will always try to find causality. They left because I wasn't enough. The friendship ended because we grew apart. The timing was coincidental. But Jung would invite you to consider another interpretation. My unconscious knew I was ready for the next stage, and it orchestrated circumstances, including their departure, to move me forward. This doesn't erase personal responsibility. You still have to examine your role in what happened, own your mistakes, learn from the experience. But it adds another dimension, the recognition that there's an intelligence at work in your life that's wiser than your ego, that's been guiding you all along, that removes people not as punishment but as protection. Protection from the person you would have become if you'd stayed. Protection from the path you would have missed if they'd remained. Protection from the comfortable prison of a life that looked good but wasn't yours. Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." That's what synchronicity is, the unconscious directing your life through meaningful circumstances. And the goal of individuation is not to stop synchronicity from happening, but to become conscious of it, to see the pattern, to recognize when yourself is removing something, because you're ready for what comes next. So when someone leaves your life and your ego is screaming that the timing is wrong, that it makes no sense, that it's unfair, consider that the timing might be more right than you can currently see. Consider that your unconscious might have access to information your conscious mind doesn't. Consider that what looks like loss might be preparation, because here's what Jung observed over and over. Years later, people could see it. They'd look back at the relationship that ended, the friend who left, the opportunity that closed, and they'd say, if that hadn't happened then, I never would have. And they'd name the thing that became their life's work, their authentic calling, their true path. The synchronicity didn't make sense in the moment. It only makes sense in retrospect, when you can see the trajectory, when you can see what became possible only because something else ended. That's the intelligence system. That's how synchronicity operates. And that's why the timing of your loss, as devastating as it feels, might be the most perfectly calibrated thing that's ever happened to you. But to understand why certain relationships had to end regardless of love or compatibility, we need to explore another dimension of Jung's work, the persona, the mask you wear to be acceptable to the world, and how certain relationships exist solely to maintain that mask, preventing your authentic self from ever emerging. That's next. There's a specific kind of suffering that most people never name, never recognize, and therefore never escape. The slow death of living as someone you're not. And the most insidious part, the relationships in your life that seem most stable, most supportive, most important, those are often the ones requiring you to maintain the mask. Jung called this mask the persona, and he warned that while developing a persona is necessary for functioning in society, there comes a point where the mask can become so rigid, so convincing, so rewarded by others, that it replaces your actual identity. You forget there's a person underneath the performance. You become the role you've been playing. And certain relationships, more than you realize, exist specifically to keep that mask in place. Let me show you what this looks like in practice, because the persona trap is so normalized in our culture that most people think it's just how relationships work. They don't realize they're dying slowly behind a face that isn't theirs. The persona is how you present yourself to the world. It's the version of you that's acceptable, appropriate, successful. For some people, the persona is the competent professional. At work and in social situations, they're polished, articulate, always in control. For others, it's the caretaker, always available, never needing anything, existing primarily to support others. For others still, it's the strong one, the funny one, the spiritual one, the successful one. These personas aren't inherently false. They're usually built from real aspects of yourself. But they become problematic, psychologically dangerous, when they become the only version of yourself you're allowed to be. When showing any other facet, your vulnerability, your rage, your confusion, your ordinariness, feels threatening, impossible, like it would cause your entire identity structure to collapse. And here's what Jung discovered. We unconsciously choose friends, partners, communities, even careers that reinforce our persona, because the persona feels safe. It's predictable. It's been socially rewarded. People like the persona. They give us validation, status, belonging, all contingent on us maintaining the mask. The problem is the self doesn't tolerate this indefinitely. There comes a point, often in midlife, but increasingly in our modern accelerated world, much earlier, where the psyche says, enough. Enough performance, enough inauthenticity, enough denying who you actually are beneath the mask. It's time to become real. And when that call comes, when individuation demands you drop the persona and reveal your authentic self, the relationships built on that mask cannot survive. Not because the people are bad, not because you've changed in some terrible way, but because the entire relational dynamic was structured around you being someone you're not. And when you stop being that person, there's no relationship left. Let me tell you about someone I'll call Catherine because her story illustrates the persona trap in its most socially acceptable and therefore most dangerous form. Catherine was a high-powered attorney. She'd built her entire identity around professional success, intellectual capability, and having her life together. She was the person her friends called when they needed advice, the one who never fell apart, the one who always knew what to do. Her social circle reflected this persona perfectly. Other professionals, high achievers, people who valued productivity, success, and maintaining control. Their conversations were about cases they'd won, vacations they'd taken, problems they'd solved. There was an unspoken rule. You didn't show weakness. You didn't admit struggle. You performed competence, and everyone else validated that performance. Catherine didn't even realize this was a persona. She thought this was just who she was, until she had a breakdown. It started with panic attacks, then insomnia, then a creeping sense that her entire life was someone else's dream. She'd achieved everything she thought she wanted, but she felt hollow, empty, like she was watching herself live from behind glass. She started therapy, started asking questions she'd never allowed herself to ask. Who am I when I'm not performing success? What do I actually want, not what am I supposed to want? What parts of myself have I been suppressing to maintain this image? The answers were devastating. Beneath the polished attorney was someone who wanted to paint, someone who valued depth over productivity, someone who needed quiet and solitude and space to feel rather than constantly solve, someone who was actually quite fragile, quite uncertain, quite human. Catherine started making changes, small ones at first. She started saying no to social events that felt performative. She started admitting when she didn't have answers. She started talking about her struggles instead of only her successes, and her social circle couldn't handle it. They didn't know what to do with this version of Catherine. Where was the competent one, the strong one, the one who had it all together? This vulnerable, uncertain, confused Catherine didn't fit the role she'd been playing in their lives. One by one, the friendships faded. Not through dramatic confrontations. That's not how persona-based relationships end. They just dissolved. Plans stopped being made. Invitations stopped coming. The dynamic that had sustained those friendships, Catherine as the capable one, them as the ones who relied on her capability, no longer functioned. Catherine's first reaction was panic and grief. She'd lost her entire social network. Everyone she thought cared about her. She felt abandoned, betrayed, devastated, but her therapist asked her a question that changed everything. Did those people ever actually know you, or did they know your persona? Catherine sat with that, and she realized they didn't know her. They knew the mask. They were friends with the performance. And when she stopped performing, there was nothing left to connect to. The relationships weren't actually with her. They were with the role she played. This is the persona maintenance trap, and it's everywhere. Look at your own relationships. Really look and ask yourself, are these people in relationship with your authentic self? Or are they in relationship with the version of yourself you've learned to perform? Do your friends know about your struggles, or do they only see your successes? Can you show up exactly as you are, messy, uncertain, changing? Or do you have to maintain a certain image to keep their approval? Would your relationship survive if you stopped playing your usual role? For most people, if they're honest, the answer is terrifying, because we realize that many of our relationships are contingent on us staying the same, maintaining the mask, continuing to play the role we've been assigned or have assigned ourselves. And the universe, or more precisely, yourself, Your individuation drive will not let you remain in those relationships indefinitely, because every moment you spend maintaining a mask is a moment you're not becoming whole. Every relationship built on performance is a relationship preventing authenticity. Every person who only knows your persona is someone standing between you and yourself. This is why the removal happens. And this is why it feels so specifically existential, because you're not just losing the people, you're losing the entire identity structure you built around performing for them. Jung observed that the persona to self transition is one of the most painful passages in individuation. You have to consciously choose to stop performing, knowing you might lose everyone. You have to risk social death to achieve psychological life. You have to be willing to be disliked, misunderstood, abandoned by everyone who only ever wanted the mask. Most people can't do it. They choose the mask over authenticity, comfort over truth. They maintain the persona and keep the relationships, but they die inside, slowly, incrementally, until they're so disconnected from their authentic self that they don't even remember who that person was. But for the ones who are willing, the ones individuation has claimed, the universe intervenes. It removes the persona maintenance relationships, even if you're not strong enough to leave them yourself. It creates circumstances that make performing unsustainable. It orchestrates synchronicities that systematically dismantle the false life so the real one can emerge. This is what happened with Catherine. Within a year of losing her entire social circle, she'd built a completely different life. She was still an attorney, but she'd shifted to nonprofit work that aligned with her values. She'd joined a painting class and discovered a community of people who valued process over product, depth over achievement. She'd made one real friend, just one, who knew her without the mask, who saw her struggles and stayed. One real friend versus 30 acquaintances who only knew her persona. And Catherine said it was the best trade she'd ever made. Because now she was actually living, actually known, actually real. That's what's on the other side of the persona removal. Not more relationships, but deeper ones. Not wider social circles, but authentic connection. Not performance, but presence. But getting there requires you to recognize when your relationships are persona-based, and to understand that their ending, however painful, is the universe giving you permission to stop performing and start being real. Here are the signs you're in a persona maintenance relationship. Sign 1. You feel exhausted after spending time with them, not the good tired of deep connection, but the depleting exhaustion of performance. Because maintaining a mask requires constant psychological energy. Sign 2. They only contact you when they need your persona, the friend who only calls when they need advice, reinforcing your role as the wise one, the partner who only sees you when you're happy, rejecting your authentic emotional range, the family member who needs you to be the successful one to feel better about themselves. Sign 3. You can't be vulnerable without the relationship shifting uncomfortably. When you try to show struggle, uncertainty, or need, they change the subject, minimize your experience, or withdraw, because vulnerability breaks the persona and the relationship was built on the mask. Sign 4. You feel like you're playing a character around them. There's a slight performance quality to all your interactions. You're editing yourself, curating your presentation, maintaining an image. You're never fully relaxed, never completely yourself. Sign 5. The relationship stays surface level no matter how long it's been. Years pass, but the conversations never deepen. You talk about events, accomplishments, superficial topics, never the real questions, fears, longings. Because depth requires dropping the mask, and the mask is what holds the relationship together. If you recognized yourself in any of these signs, you're in persona maintenance relationships. And here's what Jung would tell you. Those relationships, however comfortable, are preventing your individuation. They're keeping you false. And at some point, if you're lucky, the universe will remove them so you can finally become real. The removal might look like they move away. The friendship naturally fades. They betray you in a way that makes reconciliation impossible. You have a breakdown that reveals your persona as performance, and they can't handle the real you underneath. The relationship ends for reasons that seem external but are actually synchronistically aligned with your readiness to drop the mask. And yes, you'll grieve. You'll miss the comfort of being known, even if what was known was only your mask. You'll feel the terror of social death, the vulnerability of being without the relationships that gave you identity and belonging. But on the other side, if you do the work, if you resist the urge to immediately rebuild the same mask with new people, if you allow yourself the solitude and reconstruction period, you'll discover something extraordinary: authentic relationships, connections with people who see you as you actually are and choose you anyway, love that doesn't require performance, belonging that's based on truth rather than image. That's what individuated relationship looks like, and you cannot arrive there while maintaining persona-based connections. The universe knows this. That's why the removal happens. That's why your social circle systematically dissolved right when you were ready, whether you felt ready or not, to stop performing and start being real. Catherine's story ends, or rather continues, with her living a much smaller but infinitely more authentic life. Fewer friends, but deeper connection. Less social status, but more internal peace. Less performance, less exhaustion. Less of the hollow validation that comes from being admired for someone you're not. And the painting she started doing during her reconstruction, she never became famous, never sold a piece, but she says it saved her life, not the painting itself, but what it represented. Permission to do something with no productive outcome, no professional application, no way to turn it into persona reinforcement, just being, just creating, just existing as herself without needing to perform or achieve or impress. That's the gift hidden inside persona removal. The universe takes away the relationships that required you to be false, creating space, often painfully empty space, for you to discover who you actually are when no one's watching, when there's no role to play, when there's no mask to maintain. Most people will do anything to avoid that empty space. They'll immediately seek out new relationships to fill the void, often recreating the same persona dynamics with different faces. They'll rush into romantic relationships to avoid being alone with themselves. They'll join new communities, new groups, new social circles, all organized around the same mask they've been wearing their entire life. But if you're willing to sit in the emptiness, if you're willing to endure the discomfort of not knowing who you are without your roles and relationships, if you're willing to let the persona die without immediately resurrecting it, that's where the real transformation happens. Jung called this the dark night of the soul, the period between who you were and who you're becoming, where you exist in liminal space with no identity to cling to. It's terrifying. It feels like you're disappearing, but you're not disappearing. You're finally appearing, the real you, the one who's been suffocating under the mask. And here's what Jung observed. The people who make it through this passage, who resist the urge to reconstruct the persona and instead allow authentic self to emerge, they become luminous. Not in the sense of being impressive or successful, but in the sense of being genuinely present, real, alive in a way most people never access. You can feel it when you're around them. They're not performing. They're not managing your perception of them. They're not wearing the social mask that most people never remove. They're just there, fully themselves. And that full selfhood, however ordinary, however flawed, however unimpressive, creates a depth of presence that persona-based people can't touch. That's what becomes possible when persona maintenance relationships are removed. not a better version of the mask, not a more successful performance, but the radical authenticity of finally being yourself. The universe removed those people, the ones who only knew your mask, because it loves you too much to let you spend your entire life behind a face that isn't yours, because it knows that no amount of approval from people who don't actually see you will ever satisfy the soul's hunger to be known, because it knows that you came here to be yourself, not to be acceptable. So if you're in the aftermath of losing relationships that seemed perfect, that felt stable, that everyone thought were so good for you, consider this. Were they actually good for you, or were they good for your persona? Did those people know the real you, or did they know the performed version? And if the honest answer is that they knew the mask, then their departure isn't tragedy, it's liberation. Painful, disorienting liberation that's forcing you to ask the question most people avoid their entire lives. Who am I when I'm not performing? That question is the gateway to individuation, and you cannot walk through it while maintaining relationships that require the mask. The universe knows this. That's why it surgically removed them. That's why the timing was so precise. That's why no amount of trying to fix it, change it, or prevent it worked. You were ready, whether you felt ready or not, to stop performing and start being. And every person whose relationship was contingent on your performance had to exit so you could finally be real. Now, to make all of this concrete, to show you exactly how these principles operate in an actual human life, we need to look at a complete case study. A real person who experienced catastrophic removal, total life dismantling, and the emergence that became possible only because everything false was stripped away. This is the story that will make everything we've discussed undeniable, because you're going to see yourself in it, and you're going to understand, maybe for the first time, that your losses weren't random, they were surgical, and they were preparing you for a life you can't yet imagine. Her name was Elena, and over the course of 3 years, she lost her marriage, her 2 closest friends, her job, and her religious community. From any conventional perspective, this was complete life collapse, rock bottom, the kind of devastation that breaks people permanently. But through Jungian analysis, through the lens of synchronicity, shadow integration, and individuation, a completely different story emerges. Elena didn't experience random tragedy. She experienced systematic dismantling of a false life, so her true life could begin. Let me take you through it chronologically, showing you the precise archetypal function of each removal, the pattern beneath the seeming chaos, and why every single loss was necessary for her becoming. Year 1, the marriage ends. Elena had been married for 12 years. Her husband, Marcus, was a good man by all conventional measures, stable, responsible, faithful. They'd met in college, married at 24, built a life that looked perfect from the outside. Beautiful home in the suburbs, respected in their community, everything you're supposed to want. But Elena had been feeling something she couldn't name for the past 2 years. Not unhappiness exactly, more like a persistent sense of disconnection, like she was watching her life happen rather than living it. She'd mention it to Marcus occasionally, but he'd reassure her that every long-term marriage has phases, that what she was feeling was normal. That commitment means staying even when feelings fluctuate, so she stayed. She performed the role of good wife. She maintained the life they'd built. She told herself what she was feeling didn't matter, that love is a choice, that marriage is work. Then Elena started having dreams. In the dreams, she was always alone, not lonely, but solitary, free, walking through landscapes she didn't recognize, carrying nothing, wearing clothes that weren't hers in waking life. The dreams had a feeling tone she couldn't shake. Liberation. She didn't tell Marcus about the dreams. She was ashamed of them. What kind of wife dreams about being alone? What kind of person fantasizes about freedom while married to a good man? But the unconscious was speaking, showing her something her conscious mind couldn't yet accept. This marriage, however respectable, was built on duty rather than desire, on who she thought she should be rather than who she actually was. The end came suddenly. Marcus sat her down one evening and said he'd been offered a promotion, a significant one, but it required relocating, moving to his company's headquarters 3 states away, leaving the city where Elena had lived her entire life, leaving her community, her family, everything familiar. He assumed she'd be excited. This was what they'd been working toward: financial security, career advancement, the suburban dream fulfilled at a higher level. But when he told her, Elena's body said no, clearly, definitively, with a certainty that bypassed all rational thought. She couldn't explain it. She couldn't justify it. She just knew. If she followed him, she would die. Not literally, but something essential in her would be extinguished permanently. She told him she couldn't go. He was shocked, hurt, confused. They tried counseling, talked about compromise, considered long distance, but underneath all the negotiation, they both knew the marriage had been held together by convenience, by social expectation, by the momentum of "we've already been together this long." But there was no authentic foundation beneath it. Within 4 months, they were divorced. Elena was devastated, not because she wanted to stay married. She knew with growing clarity that the marriage had been suffocating her, but because her entire identity was built around being Marcus's wife. Her social circle was their shared friends. Her sense of self was organized around the role she played in his life. Losing the marriage meant losing her organizing narrative, losing the story she'd been telling herself about who she was. From a Jungian perspective, this was blocker removal. Marcus wasn't a bad man. The marriage wasn't abusive, but Elena's authentic path, which she couldn't yet see, required complete freedom, required her to be alone, to be disoriented, to be stripped of the identity structure she'd built around being someone's wife. The universe removed Marcus not as punishment but as preparation for something Elena couldn't have discovered while maintaining that role. Year 1 to 2. The friends exit. Elena had 2 best friends, women she'd known since high school, Sarah and Jennifer. They'd been through everything together. They were her support system, her chosen family, the people she called when anything happened. After the divorce, Elena assumed they'd be there for her even more, and at first they were. They listened to her cry, helped her move into a small apartment, reassured her that she'd been brave to leave. But then something shifted. Elena started changing in ways they couldn't understand. She'd always been the stable one in their friendship trio, the one with her life together, the one who gave advice, the one who was doing everything right. Sarah and Jennifer were both in their own relationship struggles, career uncertainties, identity crises. And having Elena be stable, be the example, be the proof that doing it right works, that's what they'd unconsciously needed from her. But post-divorce, Elena wasn't stable. She was falling apart, questioning everything, admitting she didn't know who she was. She stopped giving advice and started admitting she needed help. She stopped performing competence and started showing fragility. And Sarah and Jennifer didn't know what to do with this version of Elena. They'd get uncomfortable when she cried. They'd change the subject when she talked about her existential questioning. They'd suggest she just needed to get back out there and date again, as if finding a new man would solve the crisis of identity she was experiencing. Elena started noticing something painful. Their friendship had been built on her playing a specific role. She was supposed to be the successful one, the together one, the one who proved that traditional choices work out. They were invested in her fitting back into that role because her unraveling threatened their own belief systems. She tried to talk to them about it, tried to be honest about what she was going through. But the more authentic she became, the more they pulled away. Not dramatically, just subtly, taking longer to respond to texts, being less available, making plans without including her. Within 18 months of the divorce, both friendships had essentially ended, not through confrontation, but through fading, through the quiet dissolution that happens when the archetypal purpose is complete. Jung would identify this as mirror removal combined with persona maintenance. Sarah and Jennifer had been mirrors reflecting back Elena's false self, the successful, stable, traditional woman she'd been performing. And they'd been part of the relationship network that kept that persona in place. When Elena stopped performing, when she started revealing her authentic confusion and vulnerability, the friendships had nowhere to go, because they weren't based on knowing the real Elena, they were based on knowing the mask. And when the mask came off, there was nothing left to relate to. The loss devastated Elena even more than the divorce. Because romantic relationships end, that's common, survivable. But losing your best friends, the people who were supposed to be there no matter what, that felt like proof that something was fundamentally wrong with her. But it wasn't wrong. It was individuation. It was Elena's self systematically removing relationships that required inauthenticity, clearing space for eventually building connections based on truth rather than performance. Year 2. The job ends. Elena had worked for the same company for 8 years. Marketing position. She was good at it, reliable, promoted twice. It was stable income, good benefits, respectable work. But she'd never actually chosen it. She'd fallen into it after college because it was available, because it paid well, because it was the kind of job her parents understood and approved of. She'd never asked herself if she actually wanted to work in marketing, if it aligned with any authentic interest or calling. It was just what she did. Post-divorce, post-friend loss, Elena was barely functional at work. She'd show up, do the minimum, zone out in meetings. Her performance was slipping. Her manager noticed, pulled her aside for concerned check-ins. Elena would promise to do better, but she couldn't because she was in the middle of psychological death. Everything that had organized her identity was gone, and she was existing in a fog of disorientation. Then the company announced restructuring. Her department was being downsized, and Elena, despite her 80 years there, was let go. They gave her a decent severance package, wished her well, said she'd land on her feet. She didn't land on her feet. She crashed completely. No marriage, no best friends, no job. In 18 months, every external structure that had defined her life was gone. From a Jungian perspective, the job loss was scaffold removal. The job had provided external structure, income, routine, identity as professional woman. But it had never been authentically chosen. It had been one more element of the false life Elena had been living. The universe removed it because Elena needed to be completely unmoored, needed to have no familiar structures to cling to, needed to be forced into the terrifying question, who am I when I have nothing? Most people in Elena's position would spiral into depression, and Elena did for a while. But she also did something else. She started paying attention to the dreams. Year 2 to 3. The religious community exits. Elena had been raised Catholic, had remained active in her church community her entire adult life. It was where she and Marcus had married, where she'd volunteered, where she'd found meaning and belonging. Post-divorce, she initially tried to lean into the church even more. She needed community, needed something stable while everything else was falling apart. And at first, people were kind, sympathetic about her divorce, supportive in the way religious communities are trained to be. But then Elena started asking different questions, the kind of questions you're not supposed to ask, or at least not out loud. Questions about why God would create people with desires and callings that conflict with traditional expectations. Questions about whether suffering is actually redemptive or if that's just a story we tell ourselves to make pain bearable. Questions about whether the life she'd been living, the one that looked righteous and good, had actually been a betrayal of her soul. She mentioned these questions in a women's Bible study group. The response was immediate and uncomfortable. Several women suggested she was going through a spiritual crisis that prayer would fix. Others gently recommended she speak with the priest. The message was clear. Your questions are inappropriate. Your doubt is dangerous. Come back to the fold and stop questioning the structure. But Elena couldn't stop questioning because the structure, the entire belief system that had organized her life, had led her to a marriage that wasn't real, friendships that weren't authentic, a career she never chose, and a self she didn't recognize. If that's what doing it right, according to religious prescription, produced, then maybe the prescription itself was the problem. She stopped attending church. Not dramatically, she just quietly withdrew, stopped showing up, and the community let her go. A few people reached out initially, but when it became clear Elena wasn't coming back, they stopped trying. Within 6 months, she'd completely severed ties with the religious community that had been her spiritual home for 36 years. Jung would call this collective shadow removal. Elena had been using religious community to maintain a persona of goodness, righteousness, spiritual correctness. The community had reinforced that persona, giving her identity and belonging contingent on maintaining it. But individuation was calling her to something else. Not atheism. She was still deeply spiritual, but authentic spirituality that came from her own internal experience rather than external authority. The kind of spirituality that allows doubt, honors questions, and doesn't require her to fit into predetermined boxes. The religious community had to exit because it represented collective pressure to maintain the false self. And Elena's individuation required her to build relationship with the divine directly, unmediated by institutional control. The dark night. By the end of year 3, Elena had nothing. No partner, no close friends, no job, no religious community, no external structure, no identity that made sense. She spent 6 months barely getting out of bed, eating intermittently, crying without reason, feeling like she'd destroyed her entire life for nothing. She considered suicide twice, not actively planning it, but thinking it would be easier than continuing to exist in this unbearable emptiness. This is what Jung called the dark night of the soul, the period where everything false has been destroyed, but nothing true has yet emerged, where you exist in complete liminality with no map, no direction, no sense of who you are or where you're going. Most people cannot endure this. They'll do anything, return to the ex, reconcile with the friends, take any job, go back to the church, to escape the void. Because the void is unbearable. It feels like death. It feels like you're disappearing. But Elena somehow stayed in it. Not because she was strong. She felt weak, broken, barely alive. But because there was nothing left to go back to. Every bridge had burned. Every door had closed. There was no choice but to sit in the ashes of her old life and wait for something, anything, to emerge. The turning point. Then one night, Elena had a dream different from all the others. In this dream, she was in a pottery studio. She'd never done pottery in her life, had no conscious interest in it. But in the dream, she was working with clay. Her hands were covered in it. She was forming something, a bowl maybe, or a vessel of some kind. And the feeling tone of the dream was profound peace, purpose, rightness. She woke up and couldn't shake it. For the first time in 3 years, something felt clear. Not rational. She had no idea why her unconscious was showing her pottery, but clear. She looked up pottery classes in her city, found one that started in 2 weeks, used some of her remaining severance money to sign up. That class changed everything, not because Elena became a master potter. She didn't. Not because she found her career. Pottery would never be how she earned a living, but because for the first time in her entire life, she was doing something for no reason other than it called to her. Not because it was practical, not because it would impress anyone, not because it fit into any predetermined life plan or met any external expectation, but because her unconscious said, "This, do this." And in doing it, Elena discovered something revolutionary. She existed separate from all the roles she'd been playing. There was a self underneath the wife, the friend, the employee, the good Catholic woman. A self that had desires, interests, inclinations, that had nothing to do with what she was supposed to want. The pottery became a gateway. She started paying attention to other quiet pulls, took a weekend trip alone to the mountains, something she'd never done because Marcus didn't like hiking and her friends weren't outdoorsy. Discovered she loved it, started going regularly, found a community of hikers who knew nothing about her past, who related to her only as she was now. She got a part-time job at a bookstore, minimum wage, no benefits, the kind of job her parents would have been mortified by. But being around books, recommending stories to strangers, having simple interactions not based on impressing anyone, it felt honest, real. She started exploring different spiritual practices, Buddhism, meditation, shamanic journeying, not trying to adopt any of them wholesale, but taking what resonated and leaving what didn't. Building her own relationship with the divine that didn't require institutional mediation or predetermined answers. Over the next 2 years, Elena built a completely different life, not the life anyone would have expected or prescribed for her. Not impressive by conventional standards. She worked part-time at the bookstore and part-time at a pottery studio. She lived in a small apartment. She had a handful of genuine friends, people who knew the real her, the post-dismantling her, the authentic her. She never remarried, never went back to corporate work, never rejoined institutional religion. And when I interviewed her, 5 years after the initial marriage ending, she said something that encapsulates the entire journey. For 36 years, I lived someone else's life, a life that looked good but wasn't mine. Every person who left, every structure that collapsed, it felt like the universe was destroying me. But it wasn't destruction, it was liberation. I was being freed from a prison I didn't even know I was in. And yes, it was excruciating. Yes, I wanted to die. But on the other side of that death was a life that's actually mine. Small, ordinary, unremarkable by the world's standards, but mine. Finally mine. The pattern revealed. Looking back at Elena's story through the Jungian framework we've been building, the pattern is undeniable. The marriage removal blocker. Marcus wasn't bad, but staying married would have prevented Elena from ever discovering her authentic path. The friends removal, mirror plus, persona maintenance. Sarah and Jennifer only knew Elena's mask, and their continued presence would have pressured her to reconstruct it. The job removal, scaffold. The corporate career had provided external structure, but Elena needed to develop internal structure based on authentic choice. The religious community removal, collective shadow. The church community reinforced a persona of righteousness that kept Elena from her authentic spiritual exploration. Every single removal served her individuation. Every single loss cleared space for something more real. Every single ending was necessary for her true beginning. And the timing, all within 3 years, one after another, each loss compounding the previous, wasn't cruel coincidence. It was synchronicity. It was her unconscious knowing that half measures wouldn't work, that leaving 1 or 2 structures in place would allow her to hide from the full confrontation individuation required. She needed total dismantling, complete ego death, the destruction of every external support, so she was forced to find internal ground. Most people will never experience removal this complete, but everyone reading this has experienced some version of it. The relationships that ended, the structures that collapsed, the identities that dissolved. And the question is the same, whether it's one loss or 5. Can you see the pattern? Can you see what was being removed and why? Can you see that the person you're grieving might have been blocking you from becoming who you're meant to be? That the life that collapsed might have been someone else's prescription rather than your authentic path? That the seeming tragedy might have been surgical preparation for a life you can't yet imagine? Elena's story is extreme, but that's why it's instructive. Because when the pattern is this clear, when the synchronicity is this obvious, it becomes impossible to dismiss as coincidence. You can see the intelligence at work. You can see that something was orchestrating her life, removing obstacles, clearing path, protecting her becoming even while it felt like abandonment. Your story might be more subtle. Your removals might be spaced out over decades rather than concentrated in 3 years. But the mechanism is the same. The intelligence is the same. The purpose, individuation, wholeness, authentic self-discovery is the same. So I want you to do something right now. Map your own losses onto Elena's pattern. Write down the significant relationships that ended, the structures that collapsed, the identities that dissolved, and ask yourself, what was each removal protecting you from? What would you have become or failed to become if they'd stayed? What has become possible or is now becoming possible because they left? You might not have answers yet. That's okay. The pattern often only becomes clear in retrospect. But start asking the questions. Start looking for the intelligence beneath the seeming chaos. Start considering that your losses weren't random. They were surgical. Because once you see it, once you really see the pattern, the synchronicity, the purposeful removal, you can't unsee it. And that's when everything changes. That's when you stop being a victim of loss and become a participant in your own transformation. That's what Elena discovered, and that's what's available to you if you're willing to look at your pain differently. Not as evidence of cosmic cruelty, but as evidence of cosmic love, so fierce it will destroy everything false to reveal what's true. But to understand why these removals are necessary, why the universe can't just gently guide you toward your path without the pain, we need to explore one of Jung's most profound insights, the call that cannot be refused, and the excruciating choice between destiny and attachment. That's next. There's a moment in every person's life, sometimes subtle, sometimes unmistakable, when something deeper than your conscious desires makes itself known. Jung borrowed from mythology to call it the call, and he observed, through decades of clinical work, something both beautiful and terrifying. Most people cannot answer the call while maintaining their current relationships, not because the people in their lives are malicious or unsupportive, but because the call requires you to become someone fundamentally different from who you've been. And most relationships, especially the comfortable, long-established ones, are structured around you staying the same. This creates the central conflict of individuation, destiny versus attachment. And the universe, in its ruthless commitment to your wholeness, will force this choice by removing the attachments before the call becomes explicit. Because if you had to choose consciously, if you had to look at the people you love and say, "I'm choosing my path over you," most people couldn't do it. The guilt would be unbearable. So the removal happens first. The relationships end. The structures collapse. You're left alone, confused, devastated. And only then, when you have nothing left to lose, does the call reveal itself fully. Only when you're free does the path become visible. Let me show you what I mean by the call. I'm not talking about career goals or life plans you consciously construct. I'm talking about something that arises from depths you can't access rationally, a pull toward a way of being, a work to do, a person to become that feels simultaneously foreign and deeply familiar, like remembering something you've always known but never acknowledged. Jung noticed this pattern particularly in his midlife patients, people who had achieved conventional success but felt hollow inside. They'd done everything right: good marriage, stable career, financial security, social respect. From every external measure, they should be happy, but they weren't, because the life they'd built was based on external prescription, what parents wanted, what society valued, what seemed safe, rather than authentic internal calling. And somewhere around midlife, the psyche revolts. It says, "You've lived half your life according to other people's agendas. The second half is mine." That revolt is the call, and it usually requires dismantling everything you've built in the first half. Jung experienced this himself. At age 37, at the peak of his professional success, he had a psychological crisis that looked like a breakdown. He resigned from prestigious positions, withdrew from public life, and spent years in what he called confrontation with the unconscious, doing inner work that his colleagues thought was insanity. His marriage nearly ended, his friendships strained, his professional reputation suffered. From every conventional perspective, he was throwing away everything he'd worked for. But what emerged from that period was the entirety of his life's work: the concepts of individuation, synchronicity, the collective unconscious, archetypes. Everything that would eventually revolutionize psychology and touch millions of lives came from his willingness to answer the call, even when it required abandoning his carefully constructed life. He couldn't have done it while maintaining his previous role, while meeting everyone's expectations, while staying who he'd been. The call required complete transformation, and relationships based on his old identity couldn't survive that transformation. This is the pattern. This is how it works. And this is why the universe removes people before the call becomes explicit, because if you had to choose between your destiny and your attachments while fully conscious of the cost, the guilt and fear would paralyze you. Let me tell you about Thomas, because his story illustrates this mechanism in its most stark form. Thomas was a physician, successful practice, respected in his field, financially secure. Married for 16 years to Linda, a woman he genuinely loved. They had a good life, not passionate maybe, but stable, comfortable, companionable. Then Thomas started having persistent thoughts about something completely unrelated to medicine. Music, specifically composing music. He'd studied piano as a child, but abandoned it when his father insisted he pursue something practical. He'd spent 30 years not thinking about it. Then suddenly at age 44, he couldn't stop thinking about it. He started composing secretly, late at night after Linda was asleep, early mornings before work, using composition software he'd installed on his laptop. He didn't tell anyone, not Linda, not colleagues, not friends, because it felt ridiculous. He was a physician, a professional. What was he doing writing symphonic pieces no one would ever hear? But he couldn't stop. The music kept coming, demanding to be written. And Thomas felt more alive doing this secret, ridiculous thing than he'd felt in years of practicing medicine. Then Linda found the compositions on his computer. She didn't snoop. He'd accidentally left a file open. And when she asked about it, Thomas tried to explain. He said he'd just been dabbling, exploring an old hobby. It didn't mean anything. But Linda saw his face when he talked about it. She saw something she hadn't seen in years: passion, aliveness, complete presence. And she realized, he doesn't look at me that way. He doesn't talk about our life together with that kind of energy. His soul is somewhere else. They tried to work it out, went to therapy, Thomas promised to stop composing, to refocus on their marriage, to be present. And he tried. He really did. But the music kept calling, and ignoring it made him depressed, distant, half alive. Linda finally said what needed to be said. "You're not here, you're somewhere else, and I don't think you can be both there and with me." She was right. Thomas wanted to argue, wanted to say he could balance both, but he knew she was right. The calling he was hearing, to leave medicine, to pursue music full-time, to build a completely different life, was incompatible with the life they'd built together. Not because Linda was unsupportive, but because that life required him to be someone he was no longer willing to be. They divorced, amicably, painfully, both grieving what they were losing, both knowing it was necessary. 2 years later, Thomas had left his medical practice, moved to a small town where cost of living was low, and was composing full-time. He taught music lessons to supplement income, lived simply, barely made ends meet. But he'd never been happier. He'd answered the call. And the life he was living now, precarious, uncertain, unconventional, was his. Actually his. Not the life he'd constructed to meet external expectations, but the life that emerged when he listened to the quiet pull he'd been ignoring for decades. Could he have answered that call while staying married to Linda? Jung would say no, not because Linda was blocking him, she wasn't, but because the person Thomas needed to become to fully pursue this calling was fundamentally different from the person Linda had married. The life structure they'd built together, 2 professional incomes, suburban home, social circle of other physicians, couldn't accommodate the transformation Thomas's soul was demanding. The universe removed Linda from Thomas's path, not as cruelty, but as mercy. It freed both of them, Linda to find a partner who was actually present with her, Thomas to answer the call he couldn't refuse without dying inside. This is the pattern Jung observed over and over. When destiny calls authentically, when the self is demanding transformation, maintaining your current attachments becomes psychologically impossible. You can try. You can suppress the call, deny the pull, convince yourself it's just a phase. But the psyche won't tolerate it indefinitely. Ignoring an authentic calling manifests as depression, anxiety, psychosomatic illness, the body and unconscious conspiring to make comfort impossible until you listen. Jung documented case after case of people who became physically ill from suppressing their authentic path. The sickness would mysteriously resolve once they finally answered the call, even if answering the call looked reckless or irresponsible from external perspectives. The question becomes, how do you distinguish an authentic call from ego fantasy? Because not every desire is destiny. Not every impulse should be followed. Jung was very clear about this. An authentic call has specific characteristics. First, it persists. It doesn't go away when you ignore it. It gets louder. It shows up in dreams. It creates restlessness, discontent, the sense that something is wrong even when everything is ostensibly right. Second, it feels like remembering, not discovering. Like you've always known this about yourself, but never had permission to acknowledge it. Like you're returning to something rather than inventing something new. Third, it terrifies your ego while simultaneously feeling more real than anything else. Your rational mind has 1,000 reasons why this is impossible, impractical, too risky, but underneath the fear is absolute certainty. Fourth, it requires becoming someone you're not yet. It's not just about doing something different, it's about being different. And that transformation threatens every relationship and identity structure built around who you currently are. Fifth, other people's opinions about it don't change it. When you talk about it to people you trust and they're skeptical, dismissive, or concerned, it doesn't make the call less real. If anything, their resistance makes it clearer. that this is yours, not theirs. If what you're feeling meets these criteria, Jung would say, that's not ego fantasy. That's the self calling you toward your authentic path. And the question isn't whether to answer, because ignoring it means psychological death. The question is whether you're willing to pay the cost. And the cost is usually attachment. The people whose presence requires you to stay who you've been. The relationships that can't accommodate transformation. The life structures that demand you remain small, safe, acceptable. This is why people feel so guilty when individuation calls. Because it feels selfish. It feels like you're choosing yourself over the people who love you. It feels like betrayal. But Jung would reframe it. You're not choosing yourself over them. You're choosing truth over comfort, authenticity over performance, wholeness over fragmentation. And anyone whose love requires your continued fragmentation, whose attachment requires you to betray your soul, that's not actually love. That's control disguised as care. The universe knows this. That's why the removal often happens before you're conscious enough to choose. It takes the people who would make answering the call feel impossible. It creates circumstances that leave you no choice but to listen to what's calling. Sometimes the call is dramatic, leaving a career, ending a marriage, moving across the world. Sometimes it's quieter, finally setting boundaries, pursuing a long suppressed interest, letting your authentic self be visible. But large or small, answering requires becoming someone the people in your current life might not recognize. And here's the paradox Jung observed. When you refuse the call to maintain your attachments, you lose yourself and eventually lose them anyway. You become resentful, depressed, half alive. Your relationships deteriorate because you're not actually present. You're grieving the life you're not living.